Fortunate for me, I saw the review of this book in the New York Post, I'd say about 3-4 months ago, Eddie, and I said, you got to get me this book on the Titanic. I can't get enough of it. And it came about a month later. I had forgotten about it, and fortunately, on the way to California, I made sure I read it, and I was on top of it. And we're going to talk to Danny Parks right now. Titanic Legacy, the captain, the daughter, and the spy, which happened to be the daughter's husband. Forward by Gary Cooper, wrote the original, well, not the original, but wrote the definitive biography of Captain Ed Smith, who was the 62 years of age and captain of the Titanic in April of 1912. And we talked to Dan here on Mad Dog Unleashed. A weird one, but a fun one on a Wednesday afternoon. Daniel, nice to talk. How are you today, pal? Things good? Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, good to meet you, Mad Dog. I'm glad you got a copy of the book because that New York Post, it actually sold out quite soon after that.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, lots of people didn't get copies, so well done.
Wow, so the New York Post had that much impact. I'm happy to hear that, and it tells you the impact, and everybody can't get enough of reading about the Titanic. And you're on top of this, too. 40 years, you've done all the research. You've done 1 million TV shows on this, too. Everything has been written. All the movies have been done. What did you try to do a little differently when you put this book together? It's really more about the family than it is about the captain, but half the book's the captain. What did you try to do a little differently, informationally, entertainment-wise, to make this book a little different than all the other stuff we've read and seen on this ship? Let me hear. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, you're right. There's so many of the books that are just regurgitating the same old information. So I wouldn't have written a book. In fact, I didn't want to write a book because I collect Titanic books. I don't write them. I wouldn't want to write it unless I had something new to offer. And this new information just fell into my lap, which is to do with the fact that Captain Smith's son-in-law was found mysteriously shot in the stomach in 1930. And it turns out that he was working for MI5. So when this information fell into my lap, I was like, right, I need to write an article about this. So I started writing an article, but then it became longer than an article. As the more information I discovered, it was going to be a very long article, or it's going to be a book. And so I actually spoke to Gary Cooper that you just mentioned earlier, because he wrote, as you say, the official biography on Captain Smith. So I said to him, what do you think I should do here? And he said, Dan, I think you should write the book. And so that's what I've done. But I mean, what I did with the book to make it different was to make sure it's thoroughly researched. It's got 1,000 endnote references, so everything in there you can track down to newspapers or letters, documents, whatever. Because I didn't want to write something that's just, exaggeration or fantasy. I wanted it to be grounded in facts, as much facts as we could gather. And in doing so, I was able to bust a few myths. Myths such as the fact that supposedly Captain Smith was going to retire immediately after Titanic. Wrong. That's a myth. Or the myth that he was going too fast, that he ignored iceberg warnings. All these things came up, which I had believed for 30 years myself as being true. In the process of researching the book, I actually discovered that I'd got it wrong, that these were myths. And in doing so, I came around to actually like the guy. Because I'll be honest, when I first started writing and researching about him, I wasn't overly keen. My area of expertise has always been the deck officers, as in Chief Officer Wilde, First Officer Murdoch, and so on. And I've always been a little annoyed with the captain because I felt like he kind of caused their careers to either they died or their careers kind of dwindled out because of the Titanic disaster. But in actual fact, when you look at the facts of the captain's life, he wasn't incompetent. And I don't know how much detail you want me to go into.
Well, we're going to get into that in a minute. We're going to spend some time on Smith. And, he was 62 years of age. And, he was everybody, the wealthy loved him. He had ridden him across the Atlantic 1,000 times. But since you brought it up, let's go to the daughter quick, because the captain is a little more interesting than the daughter. But the daughter was 14 years of age when Smith died. She didn't know him that well because he's never around. He's around the world ships. And she had a very interesting life and a tragic life in a lot of cases, led, of course, or started by the fact that her husband, whatever he did, shot himself. And then she had 2 kids who died in World War II, twins. Very, very difficult. Let's go through her for a sec, then we'll go back to the captain. Go ahead. Let me hear.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, she lost all of her family before she turned 50. And that's pretty shocking, really. And they're all quite tragic situations. Like her son was an RAF pilot, and he got shot down, and ironically, his plane crashed into the sea. So again, another casualty to the sea. But I mean, her story has always been a bit of a footnote that, had a daughter, only daughter. She died at age 75 in 1973, and that was pretty much it. We didn't really know anything about her. So I was able to uncover her personal letters, some photographs of her, and discover that she was actually, in her own right, quite amazing. Do you remember in James Cameron's film, right at the end, when Rose is, well, I don't know if she's asleep or she's died or whatever, but it goes across some photos of her life, and you see one of her standing next to a biplane. And you can see that she goes on to lead quite an exciting life. Well, actually, the Captain Smith's daughter, Mel, her name was Melville, she became a pilot, and quite an adventurous woman. She was collecting art, she was driving fast cars, she was known for hospitality. So my book goes into this, and also goes into the fact that she met some of the Titanic survivors. She was involved in the filming of the 1958 British film A Night to Remember. So she didn't lead a quiet life, despite the tragedy that she endured, and especially in the case of her husband. She led quite an adventurous and exciting life in her own right. I mean, you are right. Captain Smith's story is the more dramatic, but I would say that she's quite inspirational. I mean, she's, for a woman in the 1920s, 1930s, to do what she did was quite advanced.
All right.
I mean, even now we don't have women pilots particularly.
We don't. Now, you mentioned the movie, The Titanic, of course, Cameron's movie. Overall, that's what people are going to remember who listen to this show. Did he do a very good job with the authenticity of that film in your eyes? I'm sure you've watched it 100 times. Did he do a good job with the facts with Smith, the captain? What was your take on that first, before we get into the captain here and this adventure? Go ahead.
I think it's a brilliant film.
Oh, you do?
I'm a filmmaker by trade. That's my job. So I see it from a filmmaker's perspective, and I also see it from a historian's perspective. And he did a great job. Yes, he had to fictionalize it. I mean, the main characters of Jack and Rose are not actual characters; they're fictional. But any filmmaker knows that to make a story like this palatable to a greater number of people, you need to create a story arc that people can get engaged in, and then hence explore the history. And that's what he did. And I think he does a brilliant job. I mean, I'm not a fan particularly of the Jack and Rose story, spit like a man and all these kinds of aspects of the film, which I don't particularly enjoy. But the fact that he used this as a device to explore the ship, it's brilliant. From a point of view of Bernard Hill, who played Captain Smith, I mean, they did go down the route which quite a few filmmakers have done, of showing Captain Smith as being a little bit passive, inactive during the sinking, almost like he's in shock. One thing my book does is it really dispels that myth, because it shows he was very active during the sinking. It's quite a dramatic story. He's all over the ship. He's engaging with all various crew members. He's engaging with passengers. He's involved with the loading a lot of the lifeboats. So he was very active. And also, even maybe more interesting, Mad Dog, on this one, is that his death. I mean, James Cameron portrayed Captain Smith as dying in the wheelhouse, with the wheelhouse windows imploding, which is a fantastic scene. It's very dramatic. He's at the wheel. It seems quite visually iconic, but the reality is how he died is far more dramatic.
We don't really quite know. We really don't quite know. And we'll get to that part a little later here in this discussion with Daniel.
Oh, a bit of a cliffhanger there.
Yeah, it's fun. We'll keep him on edge. And you know the movie business. Dan Parks, of course, the Titanic Legacy. Let's do a little history on Smith. Born in 1850, renowned captain, millions of ships. This was the Titanic's maiden voyage. Why did the company pick him to be the captain on a big, and it was, much ballyhooed. Everybody wanted to get on it, making an Atlantic crossing, the best, indestructible ship, and they picked him to be the captain, which tells you he must have done a good job for 40 years as a captain around the world. Go through that first for a sec. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real incredible story, because it's kind of one of those sort of rags to riches stories, because he was brought up, as you say, born in 1850 in Stoke-on-Trent. Stoke-on-Trent in England is probably as centre as you could get. In other words, it's landlocked. It's nowhere near the sea, and it's most famous for making pottery. So it doesn't seem like a likely place. Most sailors will come from port cities like Liverpool, Southampton. He came from a place that was famous for pottery, and yet he just did very well. I mean, it was nepotism at the start. He had a family member who introduced him to the trade, but he very quickly made his way through the certificates, and he became well known as the millionaire's captain. He was good at dealing with wealthy people, regaling them with stories. Maybe that landlocked heritage kind of worked in his favor, that he wasn't just a pure sailor, that he could talk on many different subjects, and hence he became well known for captaining the very large ships as they were released. The White Star Line was more in the market for luxury, while the Cunard Line, their rival, was more about speed. And so Captain Smith was the captain of quite a few large liners, leading up to the Olympic and then finally the Titanic. And he wasn't an absolute obvious choice. In fact, some passengers would time their voyages to coincide when they knew that Captain Smith was the captain. He's the iconic captain. If you ask a kid today to draw a picture of a captain, I can kind of guarantee it's probably going to look quite close to Captain Smith. The big white beard. He looks like a captain's captain. And so I think, he was extremely popular. And as I say, that people would time their voyages to be with him. In fact, they used the White Star Line used this as a marketing ploy. They used the rumor of his impending retirement as a way of enticing people to get aboard the Titanic, because then I think, oh, it's his last voyage. Actually, most probably wouldn't have been his last voyage. There was another ship that was going to be released a year later that he most likely would have been the captain of. But actually, going back to what you said earlier, because you said he's 62. One of the funny things is that actually, when he signed on to the Titanic, he signed on as age 59. And I think, like a lot of us, we always think of ourselves as younger. But the fact was that I think he didn't want to retire. He wanted to stay doing the job that he loved, which he did. He loved being a captain. He was very competent. His colleagues, the crew, all spoke very highly of him as being a competent captain, of being careful, being risk adverse. He wasn't known to do things such as ignoring iceberg warnings or traveling too fast. That he has no record of that. So that's why when we look at the facts with the Titanic, we know, well, there might be something else at play.
Now, as far as the ship is concerned, why was it considered? Now, I know there wasn't many of these instances, but why did everybody think when they built this ship that this was an indestructible vessel? What made this ship so much better built than some of the other ones that were built in the preceding, say, 15, 20 years? What made the Titanic in the White Line in the company's eyes? Give me some thoughts there.
Well, actually, Mad Dog, this is the interesting thing. Actually, it wasn't special. And it only became special because it sank. In actual fact, the label being unsinkable was a label that was used for pretty much all ships that were being built at the time, and at least 10 years prior to the Titanic.
Oh, really? Okay.
The unsinkable nature of the design was due to the watertight compartments and in some cases a double hull. So the ships of that time were all constructed the same way. They were all technically unsinkable. What made Titanic different was that it was just very slightly larger than its older sister, the Olympic. So it became technically the world's largest ship on its maiden voyage, but not by much. And in fact, when it left Southampton on the 10th of April, it was not big news. In the films, you see loads of people waving and cheering and what have you. That really happened a year before with her older sister ship, the Olympic, when it left in June 1911. There was a lot of hoo-ha then because that was the largest ship in the world. When the Titanic came along, it was the next one along. It was the sister, just slightly larger. So technically, yes, it was the largest ship in the world, but nobody really cared by now.
Interesting.
Because it was
You're right.
So this is one of those myths that grew up. But when it sank, then suddenly this label of being unsinkable became an irony and became newsworthy in the story. So it wasn't particularly special. And it's one of those things. The other one, actually, Mad Dog, that's interesting, is a lot of people will point the finger at there not being enough lifeboats. They often tie that into the fact that it was labeled unsinkable. But as I say, all ships of the time were pretty much unsinkable, or practically unsinkable, because nothing is really unsinkable. But the fact that Titanic had lifeboats for half the number, again, that was systemic. All the other ships of its time, in fact, the ship that rescued the Titanic survivors, the Carpathia, also didn't have enough lifeboats. All the ships of the time didn't have enough lifeboats for the whole passenger and crew because of a different mindset. Before the Titanic disaster, people thought that if a ship sank, you'd be able to transfer passengers to another ship nearby because ships go along like highways in the sea. There's always going to be another ship, another vehicle on the motorway. There'll be another one nearby to just transfer passengers over. So lifeboats weren't used to taking the full complement of passengers and crew at sea by itself. It would normally transfer them over to another ship. Of course, in the case of the Titanic, there wasn't another ship close enough. Well, there was, but it didn't respond. That's another story. But so hence the lack of lifeboats became an issue. But until the Titanic disaster, it wasn't really considered an issue.
Fascinating.
Like, so again, it's like a lot of things in life. We work in media. You and I, Mad Dog, so we understand how it works. You want headlines, and so the headlines are easy. Not enough lifeboats, unsinkable. But in actual fact, it wasn't unique to the Titanic.
Wow, fascinating. That just gets us started. Dan Parks on this voyage in 1912. By the way, Robert De Niro was going to play the captain in the Cameron movie, and Brad Pitt was in line to get the part that DiCaprio got. Didn't quite work out with scheduling. That was a little tidbit that our little buddy here, Dan Parks, just gave me a second ago. All right. First off, that ship was not sold out, correct? The passengers they couldn't hold 22. I know there's 1,400 and change on it. Couldn't it hold 2,200 people, Dan? Let's talk about that for a sec. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, actually, on board with 2,208.
That's right. I'm sorry.
Number.
1,400 died and 700 lived. How many could it hold, the ship?
It could hold a lot more than that. And actually, I don't know the full capacity, but it was certainly not fully booked. And it's quite unusual because at that point there was a coal strike on, so that there are actually a lot of people who were booked on other ships to go to New York or wherever. And they got transferred across to the Titanic because it wasn't fully booked, and it was one of the only ships that was leaving due to the coal strike, which had just ended. So it is quite the irony of being moved from another ship onto the Titanic and then it's sinking. You can imagine how difficult that would be to kind of handle. But yeah, it wasn't fully booked.
And I have been to the museum in Ireland a couple of years ago because that was its last stop to pick up passengers, and there's also a gravesite in Killarney. I think it's the town. There's a gravesite there of Titanic Titanic people who passed away that are in that gravesite on top of that hill over the ocean, the Irish Sea. I'm sure you know that. Give me a little rundown on its last stop before it made across. Let me hear. Go ahead.
You're talking about Cove, or what was called Queenstown Island.
Yes.
That was its last. It went to Cherbourg, in France, and then across to Cove, or Queenstown as it was called back then, and where it picked up a lot of Irish passengers, which made up a lot of the steerage or third class passengers aboard. Yeah, I mean it was its last stop. There's some fantastic imagery that was taken in Queenstown of them leaving. There's that final image that we have of Titanic leaving Ireland. Yeah, it's I actually haven't. You've got one on me because I've not been there yet. I'm hoping to go there next year.
Yeah, I went there a couple of years ago. They got they have a great museum there, Titanic Museum, and there is a gravesite about 3 or 4 miles away with American flags and everything else, and Irish flags. It is definitely worth seeing. All right, so it leaves the shores there in Ireland. It's on its way. When did Captain Smith first get wind that there was iceberg trouble? I mean, and how long? That's about a 6-day voyage, correct? About a 6-day voyage. Was it halfway through that he got warnings from captains of other ships that there was iceberg trouble? Give him a little rundown on that. Go ahead. Let me hear.
It was actually the Titanic received quite a few messages. I mean, again, because it was a maiden voyage, any ship that was passing by would want to send a message and say, well done for your maiden voyage, congratulations. And so Captain Smith received quite a few of those messages over the next few days leading up until the 14th. And in fact, one of them came from the Baltic, which was his old command. He was commanding that ship when it was launched as the largest ship of the world at the time. And but the thing that's an issue here is that people often term them ice warnings, and they weren't. A warning is watch out, look out, they're warning you of something. But most of this information about ice were contained in general correspondence. There were messages about, again, felicitations, saying, hello, Captain Smith, congratulations on your voyage. By the way, we spotted some ice here and the weather conditions are like this. So that's what most of the messages were made up of. They weren't warnings per se. And he didn't ignore them, because on the 14th, April 14th, they had actually plotted where the ice was. They knew where it would be. Because one of the things, Mad Dog, is that when you're given ice information, within half an hour, that information's useless. Because the thing with an iceberg, it's floating. So the moment you receive that message, you plot the coordinates, of course it's moved. So Captain Smith and his officers, they had a general idea that there was ice. They didn't particularly grasp how much of it had come down, because it was an ice field, as we know later. But they did know that there was ice. And so on April 14th, they had calculated, based on these ice messages, that they would reach ice by 11 o'clock. And so Captain Smith discussed this with his officers. The officers were aware that there was ice coming up. They took the precautions, but they did not decrease their speed. And there's a key reason for this, and that is that the visibility on the night of April 14th was fantastic. You could see to the horizon. And the reason for a ship to slow down, the same as if you're driving your car, the reason you slow down is visibility. If you go into fog, you slow down, or heavy rain, you slow down. And for Smith, he didn't have any reason to slow down. And there's another thing that's very important to remember, is it wasn't just called the Titanic, it was called RMS Titanic, which stands for Royal Mail Ship. It was a ship that contained mail and cargo, as well as immigrants. So it was on a schedule. They expected to arrive on Wednesday into New York. And so he would have to have a good reason to slow down. If he slowed down, his bosses would be saying, why did you slow down? He wasn't averse to slowing down, because on the Olympics maiden voyage they actually slowed down and lost about 90 minutes when they entered fog. So he was quite willing to slow down if the conditions called for it, if the conditions made things dangerous. But in Titanic's case, they could see to the horizon, so they expected to see the ice long before they got anywhere near it.
And he took a southerly route. Didn't he change his route to go a little further south from a weather condition standpoint, or did he take the normal route across that ships in those days took? How about the route?
Well, yeah, the route, as we say here in England, or the route.
Yes.
It actually, that's another one of those myths. I'd like to say that he took a more southerly route, that there's a thing that's called turning the corner. But as you come across the North Atlantic, and you basically have to kind of do a dog leg kind of corner to aim yourself for New York. And it's been popular to say that he made this call a little bit later to go further south. Unfortunately not. In fact, there's some excellent research by a researcher called Sam Halperin, who's shown that actually he turned the corner exactly on time. And that means that he was sticking to what's known as the Southern Track. So this track is what is used by all ships at that time to cross the North Atlantic. And so he was adhering to the Southern Track. Now, the Southern Track was designed to avoid ice. So there's two good reasons he was sticking to it. One is that it was what he was asked to do. Before you leave port, and he signs all the documentation, and White Star Line give him his instructions are to adhere to the Southern Track. To go off that, he would be disobeying his superiors.
Interesting.
But the second good reason why he stuck to the Southern Track is going back to what we said earlier about if a ship is sinking, you want to be where there are other ships. By being on the Southern Track, he's where other ships are also there. So hence, if there's a sinking, he could transfer passengers. No, I don't think he was thinking about sinking. But in hindsight, in context, you can see why it's important to adhere to the Southern Track. If he had gone off on a tangent, then he would definitely have not had any help.
Right. Now, the other thing that's interesting is that the inquiries they did both in New York and in England following this terrible tragedy They brought up 1 million captains with 468 years of experience. Was that the number? Who all thought that he didn't do anything wrong and all said, I've gone the same speed with icebergs across the Atlantic 1,000 times and I didn't hit an iceberg, which gave people like myself who read it, well, unlucky more than anything else, because it sounds like the speed and the route is the same thing that had been done for 15 years by all these seasoned captains who took the stand one right after another with 2 inquiries and really supported Smith and said he was okay. Go through that. Let me hear.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There were 14 captains. Now, I must say, it's not all captains. There was one captain who, actually, no, sorry, there were 2 captains who came out and disagreed with Captain Smith, but 14 agreed with him and said that what he did was what we call SOP, Standard Operating Procedure, protocol. It's what everyone would have done. And also, Mad Dog, interestingly enough, it's what everyone does even now. Because, like I say, the protocol he adhered to, which was that invisibility, he would maintain speed. We all do that now. If you're driving to work and you hear that there's going to be a traffic jam, when do you slow your car down? You don't slow it down as you're going out your driveway. You slow it down
when you get
once
close
you see
to
the
the traffic
jam.
jam. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's the way it works. So with Smith was the same, because he didn't know where the ice was. It could disappear. It could have melted. It could have gone away. He was waiting to see it, and then he would make action. In fact, a lot of people think that he was asleep at the time of the collision with the ice. I actually personally believe he was in the chart room plotting possible evasive routes that he could take, or routes, I should say, that he could take to avoid the ice. So he was looking at options. Going back to the captains, there were 14 that were adamant. In fact, they didn't speak once, they spoke twice, and both times under oath. Some of them were from the rival Cunard line, so it wasn't just White Star colleagues, backslapping each other. There were 2 who spoke out against it. Ernest Shackleton's one, and dare I say, look at what happened to him. And William Turner was another one, and guess what? Who he was captain of? He was the captain of the Lusitania.
Wow, that's right. Which got blown
So
up.
I'm afraid
which got blown up by German torpedoes, despite all sorts of warnings in 1914. So there you go.
Exactly. So I'm afraid to say the 2 that spoke out don't exactly.
What happened to the first one? What happened to the first one? What did he do? Edward.
Sorry, first what?
No, you said there were 2
Ernest
captains.
Shackleton.
The first one with the second with the Lusitania. How about the first one? What happened with him?
Well, Shackleton was an ice explorer, and he got stuck in ice.
Oh, that's
and
right.
Lost a ship
In Antarctica. That's right.
So I mean, this was interesting because obviously it was ice, right? So you think, but I mean, he wasn't a captain of a passenger seagoing ship. He was captain of explorer ships that had their bows designed to cut through ice. So I don't think he's particularly in the right position to comment anyway, but he faced disaster as well. So people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones.
Excellent point. Now, do you think that any of Smith's crew, did they see the iceberg before they hit it, or did they hit the iceberg and they didn't see it? Despite visibility, they saw the iceberg, correct, before they hit it? Tell me about the exact moment of impact. It was about 11:25 at night on that night on the 14th. Give the folks the exact moment of impact. Did they see it prior? Did they try to get around it? Give them a little sense on that. Go ahead.
Well, it's exciting. It's one thing that James Cameron does a very good job of portraying in his film. But it was 11:39 p.m. on the 14th of April when the 2 men in the lookout's nest spotted an iceberg. Now, they spotted it very late, and it's not due to lack of binoculars. That's another myth which is out there, or anything of that nature. It seems that the berg, due to the fact that there was no breaking waves, due to the fact that there was no moon, and some other perhaps environmental conditions, it wasn't spotted until the last moment. Now, First Officer Murdoch was officer of the watch, and he spotted it also at 11:39-ish. In fact, he may have heard them strike the bell, which was to warn that something was dead ahead. But First Officer Murdoch was the one who had to make the call. And so he looks straight ahead at this iceberg, and he has to make a decision to either go left or right, or to hit it head on. Some people have said, in hindsight, that he should have just hit it head on, and maybe things would have worked out right. But then who in their right mind would hit an iceberg head on?
Nobody.
I mean,
Right.
It's
You try to get around it. You try to get around it.
Exactly. So I think he looked at the iceberg. Descriptions of the iceberg give me the kind of indication that perhaps he saw it as an option to go to the left, which the order to the helmsman was hard to starboard, which actually turns the ship to left, because it's what's known as old tiller commands, like when we used to use a rudder on a rowing boat. But we're into the technical side of that. But what he did is he tried to turn the ship hard to the left. He didn't. One thing that James Cameron got wrong is he shows the props being reversed, put into reverse. Full astern is the order that's given. Actually, there's no evidence that the ship was put full astern, because a lot of people will say that will be the wrong decision anyway, because it would reduce its maneuverability. There'd be less water going across the rudder, and hence it couldn't turn fast enough. I think that's quite true. I don't think First Officer Murdoch did order full astern. There's no evidence to suggest it. The engine room, people who survived from the engine room don't report it. So I think he probably ordered stop on the engines and hard starboard, and he almost pulled off a miracle. I mean, the ship got so close to the iceberg, or so close to avoiding the iceberg, that it seemed like he had pulled it off. But as you know, I mean, a lot of people say that 80% of an iceberg is below the water. Well, that's sadly the case. That something below the water is what struck the ship and breached too many compartments.
How much time are you thinking that he saw the iceberg before it hit the ship? A minute? 2 minutes?
Yeah.
What's your bet?
Probably no more than a minute.
Oh, not more than a minute. So he had 1 minute in your research, and all the things you've done with it for the last 50 years. He had essentially 1 minute to make a life-determining decision on his ship. That is, and why was he captaining the ship and not the other, and not Ed Smith? How come he was? Is that just the ship the way it was with the ship? You can't do it 24/7. So it was his turn to captain the ship at that time.
Yeah, there's always what's known as an officer of the watch, and there are 3 officers who take turns of being officer of the watch. And basically, an officer of the watch is managing everything that's going on, but will report to the captain or get the captain's input on what's going on. Captain Smith spoke to Second Officer Lightoller, who was officer of the watch before Murdoch, and they spoke about the conditions and whether that anything should change, and they didn't think so at the time that anything should change, and that information would have been passed on to First Officer Murdoch. He had to make a call because obviously he didn't have enough time to go to the captain and get his response. In fact, people do say that Captain Smith seemed to take too long to respond. I don't think it was anything more than a minute before he came out.
Wow.
But I believe that makes sense to me personally, because as a commander, if you've you've delegated the responsibility to someone as capable. I mean, First Officer Murdoch, a Scotsman, was the most capable sailor aboard that night. I've researched his life thoroughly, and he was, the sea ran in his blood. He was a brilliant sailor. So Captain Smith knew he would make the right decision. And I think he left it to him, and he didn't just rush out there to try to say, "What are you doing?" He just let him make that decision, and then calmly came out to see what had happened. And as James Cameron very well portrays, because he's based on the inquiry conversations, is that Smith comes out and says, what's happened, and Murdoch says we've struck an iceberg.
All right, hang in there. We'll get to the results of this. Daniel Park, a superb job here. If you care about the Titanic, you're learning about it most importantly. With Daniel Parks here, the Titanic Legacy on the Titanic and the family, Smith and his daughter. We did a little of the daughter earlier in the interview here. He's done a wonderful job. It didn't seem like Smith knew pretty quick that this ship was going to go down, right? It wasn't he didn't figure this out in 45 minutes. They knew within, 15 minutes there, Dan, that this ship was due to sink? Well, give me a little sense of the timing of once it hit the iceberg and once they knew they were in a dire situation. Let me hear.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know exactly when. But I would say 30 minutes.
Oh, 30 minutes.
To be about right. Because what he had to do, he had to send out a crew to do an inspection report and send a report back to him. So he had to field all these different reports that were coming into him from the engine room, from the boilers, from the areas that had been damaged. But what you see very early on is he was quite proactive. He immediately was in contact with the wireless operators to start sending out messages. He made sure that they were calculating their position, even though they got that slightly wrong, as it happens. And he was also getting the lifeboats uncovered and ready long before he got the report, which would have been most likely from Thomas Andrews from Holland and Wolff. who would have said, "Look, I think an hour and a half is how long the ship's going to last." Which I mean, it must have been an incredible thing for him to have received that information, to know that he's on board a ship with over 2,000 people, and it's going to sink within an hour and a half.
Now,
And
why did the lifeboats, the lifeboats go into the water with less than capacity? These are 60-person lifeboats, and there's 20 people in them. Why was that? Was that disorganization? Why did that occur, Dan? How about that?
yeah, I mean it's a good question, and the answer quite simply is that people were not wanting to go into a lifeboat. If you look at the lifeboat, like these small wooden boats compared to the Titanic, big luxurious ship, it seemed like a safer option to stay on board the ship.
Oh, really? Wow.
And the other thing that Smith did, I mean, this is this is the way he managed the situation, is he didn't want to cause a panic, because if he had immediately alerted everyone to the fact the ship was sinking, I don't think they would have launched even half the lifeboats that they did. As it happened, they launched pretty much all of them. The last two weren't properly launched in davits. They kind of floated off.
How many lifeboats did they have?
20.
20. Okay, so they launched 18 of the. They launched
plus,
18 of the 20. Okay, gotcha.
And yet, I think it's quite a feat. And he was involved in a lot of those launches of the lifeboat. He was very proactive about that, because if he'd caused a panic, I don't think they would have achieved it. So it was this kind of balance between not causing panic but getting people off the ship. Now, on the one side was First Officer Murdoch, who we just discussed was there when they hit the iceberg. He launched the most number of boats with the most number of people. So he did a very good job of that. Second Officer Lightoller, on the other hand, didn't launch as many or with as many people. And there's a simple reason for this, is that the order was women and children first. And that's the way that Murdoch looked at it. But Lightoller on the other side looked at it as women and children only. And so he was stopping, even, stewardesses because they were crew, and a 14-year-old boy because, he's a man. Kind of, there was all these kinds of issues that Lightoller was having.
Right.
So, but all through this, Smith wasn't perfect. I do think there was in fact, what I just spoke about, the difference between women and children first and only, I think is a case of mismanagement, that he should have seen what was happening with Lightoller and maybe said, look, make it women and children first and then let some men on. It's better to have men on board a lifeboat than nothing at all. So, there are issues there. He wasn't perfect. But I think it's very unfair to show him, James Cameron shows him kind of walking around in a stupor, in shock. That
was not the case, though, in your eyes. Maybe he was.
Well, he was too busy.
He was too busy. Okay.
He's all over. I mean, if you track his movements, he's all over the place. He must have experienced shock, and I do believe that in his dying moments, he was thinking of his wife and daughter because of what he was doing. I don't know if you want to get onto this or not, but how he died is actually, I think, more dramatic than what even James Cameron shows.
Listening to Mad Dog Unleashed, Mad Dog Sports Radio, live from the Paramount Plus studios. Visit ParamountPlus.com/NFL to get started today. Dan Parks, The Titanic Legacy, an historian, a movie maker, wonderful book, came out about 3 or 4 months ago. Remember, there were 2 people alive who were babies on the ship when 1997 came and Cameron made the movie. 2 infants on that ship who would be alive when that movie was put out in 1997. All right, let's get back to Smith. No way. I don't think he shot himself. I know that was a rumor. I don't buy it. What do you think his final moments were? Jumped in the water, saved passengers. He could have gotten on a lifeboat, did not. Give me a little sense on what you think his last 20 minutes of his life was about. Give me a little feel there. Go ahead.
Well, there's this kind of maritime sailors tradition that a captain goes down with his ship. And that's exactly what he did. I mean, he did go down when the bridge went under the water. He was seen by several survivors as jumping off the bridge. And then he was also seen by survivors on upturned collapsible B as swimming up to that collapsible, but not trying to save his life. In fact, he was trying to save the life of a child or children. And I'll be honest, I heard this before I researched the book, but I've always considered it to be a bit of an urban myth. It's always too good to be true, isn't it? The captain trying to save some children. But once I actually went and did the research, I discovered that it's a very consistent tale. And not only that, there's another researcher, excellent author by the name of George Behe, based in the States, and he's just released a book about a year before mine. He came to the same conclusion that these stories of Smith jumping off with children or a child under his arm, trying to save the life of some children, aren't just rumors, aren't just an urban legend, because there's a consistent report that he tried to save the life of these children. He took them to the upturned collapsible B. Unfortunately, they didn't survive. And thanks to some research and evidence I was able to uncover, we know the names of those children. That they were Swedish children. I've got the permission from the family to include their photographs in the book. And I think it's fantastic because we mentioned earlier about his daughter was 14 years old. She just had her birthday a few days before the Titanic departed. 14-year-old, and his wife. I'm sure that Captain Smith was thinking of family in his dying moments, and the fact that he tried to save the life of a child or children in his last act as a captain, I think it ties in very well what we know about him. As a very generous, competent man.
All right, so how do we look at him then overall? There are some statues and monuments. I shouldn't say monuments, but there's some recognition of him in some spots in England. I mean, you hit it right on the head. This is a strong-willed man who went down with his ship, tremendous character, but he's the captain of the Titanic. So how do I evaluate him historically?
I mean, this is the problem, isn't it? I mean, is he victim or villain? How do we define it? I don't think he's either. I think he was human. It is interesting that in the days after the sinking, initially there were these reports of him saying be British. He was seen as a bit of a hero. Once the shooting himself was seen as being obviously false information, there was this moment where he was considered a hero. But then as the gravity, the enormity of the disaster, especially with the inquiries that took place later, the tide kind of turned against him, in all honesty. In fact, his family, his widow and daughter, had to leave Southampton because in Southampton, the city the Titanic departed from, most of the crew came from Southampton, and they say that almost every street in Southampton, someone was lost on the Titanic. So Southampton was full of people who were mourning, and you can understand when there's a disaster, we do tend to want to point a finger at somebody. And Smith, I mean, I don't think he caused the disaster. I don't think there was anything he did specifically that caused the disaster, but as captain, he has to take responsibility for it. It happened on his watch. So, and the fact is he did take responsibility. He went down with the ship. But there were those in England who did want to set up a statue, and they did eventually set up a statue to him in Lichfield, in Staffordshire, which is a bit odd because he didn't actually come from Lichfield. He came from Hanley, Stoke-on-Trent, which is quite a few miles away from Lichfield. But it seemed like a good place. I mean, no one there really knew him, but there is quite a impressive statue to Captain Smith there, which is what we've got. But it's pretty much the only statue. There's nothing in Southampton that is a memorial to Captain Smith.
Why, in a minute here, Dan, why are people still so fascinated with this story?
There's something for everyone. Whatever your interest is, if it's engineering, if it's fashion, if it's history, Titanic's got it. You've got these three classes of people who went down on the ship, and also the crew and people like Captain Smith. There's so many stories and so many angles that there's one interesting thing. The last descendant of Captain Smith said, when she was asked the question about why is it still popular, she says, the ship just doesn't sink. It almost like just keeps living in our memories. It just doesn't sink. I think everyone reads the story going, it won't sink. I hope it doesn't sink. So it's got everything that anyone would want. It's a perfect parable. I'm sure it's used in a lot of sporting events, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It's used for everything because it's got something for everyone.
And 1,400 people, right? Passed away?
1,496.
And
Yeah, 712 survived.
712 survived. All on that Carpathian ship, or they survive? They all jumped on board that ship an hour later. Is that what it was?
Yeah, the Carpathia. The Carpathia picked up the lifeboats. I mean, originally people said 705, but the official number is 712.
Wow, 712. What a job. Dan, I loved every minute of it. The Titanic Legacy, sell 1 million copies and do a lot of good movies and research stuff. Appreciate you coming on today.
Yep. the second edition's out now, so check it on Amazon.